The German shepherd suddenly froze, a low growl rumbling in its throat, its eyes fixed on a dark fissure in the cliff face. Its companion, the veteran Jax, knew this signal could not be ignored. He switched on his flashlight, and the white beam cut straight into a scene that no amount of training could have prepared him for. Huddled in the corner of the cave was a man, or rather, the shadow of one, with eyes wild with fear. And the dog, it was no longer growling, but instead let out a quiet whine, as if it sensed a pain greater than any danger. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. Where are you listening to this story from? The air in Montana's Custer-Gallatin National Forest was thin and sharp, tasting of pine and the coming winter. For Jax, it was the only medicine that worked. He moved through the dense woods with a quiet economy of motion that spoke of long practice, his worn leather jacket shielding him from the late autumn chill. He was a man in his 40s, tall and lean with a quiet strength in his frame. His brown hair, cut short, was threaded with silver at the temples, and his face, though etched with a certain weariness, held a fundamental kindness in its lines. Beneath the jacket, a faded plaid shirt was layered over a simple gray t-shirt, tucked into denim jeans that had seen better days. His sturdy work boots made almost no sound on the thick carpet of fallen leaves. At his side, trotting with an equally silent grace, was Shadow. The 5-year-old German shepherd was a striking animal, his thick coat a mixture of slate gray and pale white, giving him an almost ghostly appearance in the dappled light. His intelligent eyes missed nothing, constantly scanning their surroundings before returning to Jax, a silent check-in that was the foundation of their bond. Shadow was Jax's anchor, the calm presence that helped quiet the relentless roar inside Jax's head, a phantom echo of a war he had left behind but could never truly escape. They came to these wild, empty places seeking a silence profound enough to drown out that inner noise. But today, the silence felt different. Jax stopped abruptly, his head cocked. It wasn't a sound that had halted him, but a sight. A single, thick branch on a young aspen was snapped cleanly, the pale wood a stark wound against the bark. It was too high for a deer and too deliberate for a random break from the wind. His eyes narrowed, and his entire posture shifted from that of a hiker to a tracker. He knelt, his gloved fingers hovering over the ground. There, almost lost in the duff, was the faint outline of a boot print. It wasn't the deep, confident tread of a hiker with modern gear. This was shallow, scuffed, the mark of someone dragging their feet, someone exhausted. A low whine rumbled in Shadow's chest. The dog stepped closer to Jax, his nose twitching as he tasted the air, every muscle in his body suddenly tense with alert. He sensed it too, the wrongness. Jax gave the dog's neck a reassuring squeeze, his gaze fixed on the direction the faint trail seemed to lead. A cold knot of unease tightened in his stomach. This was not the trail of a lost tourist. Professional curiosity, mixed with a primal sense of duty, compelling him forward. He looked at Shadow, whose alert stance was all the confirmation he needed. Together, they left the semblance of a path and began to follow the scattered, desperate signs, moving deeper into the wilderness. The trail led them away from the rolling hills and towards a forbidding wall of sheer rock, a place where the signs of life seemed to simply vanish into the cold, unforgiving stone. The rock face was a dead end, a cold granite wall that defied passage. But Jax's training had taught him to look for the subtle impossibilities. He felt it before he saw it. A faint, cool draft against his cheek, a stream of air that smelled of damp earth and long-held stillness. He ran his hand along the rock, pushing aside a thick curtain of overgrown, thorny bushes near the base. Behind them, like a secret scar, was a fissure, a dark opening barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Shadow pressed close to his leg, a low growl suppressed deep in his throat, his body coiled with tension. Jax placed a hand on his head. "Easy, boy," he whispered, his voice a low murmur. He pulled a small, powerful flashlight from his pack. With one last look at the autumn sky, he took a breath and slipped into the darkness, Shadow following so closely his fur brushed against Jax's leg. The air inside was heavy and cold, thick with the smell of mold and something else, something wild and desperate. The beam of his flashlight cut a sharp white cone through the absolute blackness, revealing glistening, damp walls that narrowed into a tight passage before opening into a larger chamber. Jax moved with immense care, his boots making soft, deliberate sounds on the gritty floor. He swept the light across the space, the beam revealing the bones of small animals, piles of debris, and then it stopped. In the farthest corner of the cave, the light landed on a human form. Jax's breath caught in his throat. It was a man, or what was left of one, huddled into a tight ball with his knees drawn up to his chest. His hair and beard were a single matted, filthy tangle, and his clothes were tattered rags that barely clung to his emaciated frame. As the light hit him, he flinched violently and pressed himself harder against the rock, a choked, guttural sound escaping his lips. His head lifted slowly, and his eyes found the beam. They were wide, utterly wild, and shining with a pure, primal terror. They were the eyes of a cornered animal, a creature that had lived so long in the dark it had forgotten the Sunday. This was Elias. The sight struck Jax with the force of a physical blow. He saw past the filth and the fear. He saw the frantic, desperate energy, the absolute disconnect from the reality Jax was standing in. In those terrified eyes, Jax recognized the same haunted abyss he fought to keep at bay every single day. This was not a drifter. This was not a man who had simply lost his way. The frantic breathing, the way he was trapped in a moment of pure panic, it was all terrifyingly familiar. Jax lowered the flashlight just a little, the realization washing over him with an icy certainty. He was looking at another soldier, a brother in a war of the mind, a man who was being completely and utterly consumed by the very same roar that echoed in Jax's own soul. Every instinct screamed at Jax to act, to call for backup, to begin a rescue. But the soldier in him, the part that understood the landscape of a terrified mind, knew that would be a catastrophic mistake. A standard rescue would be seen as an assault. It would shatter the fragile psyche of the man in the cave and could put them all in danger. Slowly, deliberately, Jax lowered the beam of the flashlight until it pointed at the ground. Then he began to back away. He made no sudden moves, his steps measured and soft as he retreated through the narrow passage and emerged into the fading light of the afternoon. He did not run. He simply withdrew, a tactical retreat from a battlefield he could not win with force. Once clear of the opening, he stopped and let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He could leave now. He could hike back to a place with a signal and report a missing person. But he knew in his gut that by the time a team was assembled, the man he had seen might be gone, or worse. He looked at the hidden entrance, then down at Shadow, who was still rigid with a tense alertness. No, he couldn't leave. He was the only one who understood. He made his decision. He would stay. Jax chose a spot in a small sheltered clearing about 50 yards from the cliff face. It was close enough that his presence could be felt, that the scent of his campfire might carry on the breeze, but far enough away that he would not seem like a threat. He worked methodically, gathering dry wood, clearing a small circle of ground, and setting up his modest camp. As twilight began to bleed purple and orange across the sky, he struck a match and brought a small, controlled fire to life. It was not a bonfire for signaling. It was a hearth fire, a small beacon of warmth and light that served as a silent invitation, an offering of stability in the vast, indifferent wilderness. The final, crucial piece of this fragile truce was Shadow. The German shepherd had remained on high alert, his body stiff and his gaze locked on the cave entrance. He could smell the potent fear emanating from the rock. Jax sat down on a log by the fire and patted the ground beside him. "It's okay, boy," he said softly. He reached out and stroked the dog's back with a firm, steady hand, communicating not with words, but with a feeling of calm authority. Shadow absorbed his owner's tranquility. The tension slowly drained from his powerful shoulders. His ears, which had been pricked forward, softened. After a long moment, he took a deep sigh and lay down in the dirt, his body facing the cave. He was not asleep. He was on watch, a silent guardian whose peaceful posture radiated a clear message into the darkness. "We are not a threat. We mean you no harm." The first knot of fear had been untied. Days bled into one another, each marked by the slow rising and setting of the autumn Sunday. A quiet, unspoken routine settled over the small clearing. There was the morning, where Jax would methodically prepare his coffee and share a piece of jerky with Shadow. There was the afternoon, spent in the silent tasks of gathering wood or simply sitting, watching the trees. And there was the night, illuminated by the soft, dancing light of the fire. Through it all, a profound silence reigned. Jax never called out to the cave. He never tried to force a conversation. Instead, he spoke a different language, one intended only for the broken. At night, sitting before the flames, he would talk in a low voice, not to the cave, but to his dog, to the fire itself. He spoke of nightmares that smelled of dust and cordite. He spoke of the hypervigilance that never faded, the way a falling pine cone could sound like a distant mortar. And he spoke of the roar, the constant humming pressure in his skull that was the ghost of 1,000 shouting voices and explosions, a sound that silence could never truly conquer. He was not asking for a response. He was simply taking the immense weight of his own trauma and setting it down in the open, sharing his burden with the empty space, a confession whispered to the wilderness. From the absolute darkness of the cave, Elias watched. He had spent months, maybe years, with only the terrifying sounds in his own head for company. Now, there was this new routine. The man outside never approached. He never shouted. His movements were calm and predictable. And the dog, the large gray animal, was a picture of peace. It lay by the fire, it followed the man, but it never acted like a predator. It was simply there. The man's low, nighttime ramblings were just sounds at first, but slowly, fragments of words began to pierce through Elias's fog. Nightmares, the roar. The words resonated in the scarred corners of his mind. He was not being hunted, he was being seen. Then, one late afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows through the pines, the dog became the decisive bridge. Shadow, who had been dozing by the dwindling fire, lifted his head. He seemed to sense the crushing weight of loneliness that emanated from the dark fissure in the rock. He stood up, stretched his long gray body, and with a quiet determination, he began to walk. He didn't run or bark. He simply walked slowly, deliberately, across the clearing, closing the 50 yards of empty space. He stopped about 10 feet from the hidden entrance, and after a moment, lowered himself gracefully onto the pine needles. He laid his head on his paws, his intelligent eyes soft. The gesture was a simple, profound statement of acceptance, a wordless affirmation that said, "I am here, and I will not harm you." And deep within the cave, Elias saw this offering. His body tensed, his first instinct to scramble deeper into the blackness. But he did not. For the first time, he held his ground. The change came without warning. One moment, the night was still, wrapped in the cold, clear silence of the high country. The next, the wind began to howl, tearing through the pines with a mournful sound. The sky, which had been filled with stars, was swallowed by a suffocating blanket of black clouds. A distant flicker of lightning illuminated the horizon, followed moments later by a low, deep rumble that felt like it was coming from the very bones of the earth. The storm fell upon them not with a gentle rain, but with a sudden, violent assault. Thunder cracked overhead, sharp and explosive, and from the darkness of the cave, Jax heard it. A choked, terrified scream, a sound of pure, unadulterated panic. It was the sound of a man not startled by a storm, but thrown back into the hell of a battlefield. Jax's own body tensed, the sound a jolt to his nervous system. Every protective instinct told him to run to the cave, to offer aid. But he fought it down, knowing that his appearance in that panicked moment would only be seen as another threat. He had to be the anchor, not another wave in the chaos. He stayed firmly planted on his log, adding another piece of wood to the fire, making the small flame burn brighter against the raging dark. Beside him, Shadow whined softly but did not move, his trust in Jax overriding his own animal instinct to seek shelter. The dog was a solid, warm presence in the maelstrom. Jax cleared his throat and raised his voice, pitching it to carry over the roar of the wind and rain. He wasn't shouting, but speaking with a loud, steady confidence. "It's just a storm," he called out towards the unseen cave entrance. "Just thunder. We are safe here. It's going to be okay." He repeated the words like a mantra, a shield of sound against the percussive blasts of thunder. He spoke them as much for the man in the cave as for himself, the simple phrases a lifeline to the present moment, a defense against the ghosts awakened by the storm's fury. The storm raged for hours, and then, as suddenly as it began, it moved on, leaving behind a profound, dripping quiet. The fury was replaced by the gentle sound of water dripping from pine needles. Dawn arrived slowly, a weak, gray light filtering through the clouds, revealing a world washed clean. The fire had burned down to a pile of glowing orange embers, breathing faint smoke into the cool air. And in that quiet, fragile light, the miracle happened. From the dark fissure in the rock, a figure emerged. It was Elias, trembling visibly, his body stooped with an exhaustion so deep it seemed painful. He moved with a hesitant, shuffling gait, and for the first time he voluntarily stepped out of the darkness. He didn't go far. He just sat down on the cold, damp ground at the very edge of the cave's mouth, closer to the fading warmth of the embers, closer to the man and his dog who had been his anchors in the storm. That first step from the cave was a breach in a dam of fear, and in the days that followed, a slow, tentative healing began to trickle through. After the storm, Jax began a new routine. Each morning, he would leave a canteen of fresh water and a portion of his own rations near the cave entrance. He would retreat to his fire, and after some time, the offerings would disappear. The progress was slow, measured not in words, but in feet. Elias began to spend the morning hours sitting at the edge of his sanctuary, just a silhouette in the shadows, while Jax sat by his fire. They shared the quiet of the early day from their separate positions, two lonely outposts finding a strange comfort in the other's silent presence. The space between them was no longer filled with fear, but with a fragile, unspoken respect. Several more days passed. Jax knew their time in this wilderness was nearing its end. His supplies were running low. On a crisp, clear morning, he made his decision. He began to pack his few belongings with a slow, deliberate finality. He rolled his sleeping bag and doused the last of the fire. As he was strapping his pack shut, a movement from the cave made him pause. Elias stepped out from the shadows, fully into the morning light. He stood straight, his shoulders back, a flicker of a soldier's bearing returning to his gaunt frame. He said nothing. He simply looked at Jax, his eyes holding a lifetime of pain, but also a glimmer of profound clarity. Then he turned his head and looked pointedly toward the faint game trail that led back toward civilization. The question was asked and answered without a single word. Jax held the older man's gaze for a long moment and gave a slow, single nod. That was all it took. Elias turned and took his first step onto the path, and Jax fell into step a few paces behind him, Shadow moving quietly to walk between them. The final scene was not a joyous reunion or a triumphant rescue. It was a slow, somber procession. Two men from two different wars, both hollowed out and scarred by the things they had seen, were walking out of the wilderness. They were gaunt, exhausted figures, moving with the careful steps of those who have forgotten what solid ground feels like. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Shadow padded alongside them, a loyal, steady guardian, his presence a living testament to the bridge of trust that had been built. They were walking together out of the darkness, not back to a world they no longer fit into, but toward a new, uncertain path, one they had finally found the courage to walk, knowing they would not have to walk it alone. The deepest wounds are often reached not by words, but by the quiet courage of a shared silence and the unwavering loyalty of an animal who asks for nothing but gives everything. The journey of these two soldiers and their faithful guardian reminds us that no one has to walk their path alone. If this story resonated with you, we hope you'll become a part of our Voice of Pause community by subscribing. Your likes and shares help us spread these messages of hope, and we would be honored to read about the loyal companions who have been an anchor in your life in the comments below. The next story of compassion and courage is ready for you now on your screen.